Thank you and good evening, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for all those who have worked behind the scenes to have me here. I'll join and say something about El-Katan Foundation. A week or 2 weeks ago, a proud father from Gaza sent me by WhatsApp, of course, a little clip with his daughter dancing dabke. You know, you'll say, of course, why not? Yeah, but it's Gaza, and there are boys and girls in the class, and the instructor is a man, and the girls, I think, are not veiled or without the mandil. And I asked the father, one of my old friends from Gaza, so where is it taken place? And he says, Muassasat El-Katan. And that's very important because I said, oh, it's like you 20, 30, 40 years ago when you were in the Jabha or whatever, dancing dabke as a statement to all. And this is a statement, but this is also very important for the children and for the parents. And as for me being living in the occupied territory, in the occupied Palestinian territory, I say that I'm a typical Israeli because I establish facts on the ground. So as a journalist, I'm allowed to go there with some permission from the army, but living there is not. So it's my Israeli side. And when I go out of Ramallah and drive, I discovered that the radio is the driver's best companion, particularly for me when I go to all those places to just document another maddening piece of reality. So for the scores of radio stations, Palestinian radio stations that exist, I usually listen to two. One is Sot Palestine, the voice of Palestine, and the other one is Radio Ajial. The first one is, I would say, an official mouthpiece. The other is more daring at bringing critical voices. But both stations have two similar programs. One is an open hotline where people call to complain about Palestinian red tape, while the anchor is reaching out to officials and in charge and asked for their responses and possible solutions. So it can be a person who is sick and doesn't find the right insurance or the right doctor, and sometimes electricity problems or jammed roads, all those sort of those things. The other program is live messages of families to their dear ones in Israeli prisons. There are such, I think almost every day there is a program that parents or spouses call and talk to the prisoners and tell them things. And they share with the listeners and with the whole world, actually, and also with the Shabak, all kind of domestic details. So the children's good, how they are doing at school, it's always very good. And the sisters' engagement, and everybody is fine and don't worry about us. Sometimes a mother would start crying and restrain herself, or a spouse. Children talk to their parents, to their fathers. Just the other week, I heard one woman, the wife of a prisoner, I think by the accent she was from south of, around Hebron, I didn't catch, and she said that how marvelous the lemon blossom is in their garden, and she hopes there will not be too many blossoms before he comes back, inshallah. And in between the programs, there are commercials, and I also listen to them very attentively. And for example, this one, two friends are talking, and it's so casual that you don't really know what they're talking about. And then one sounds a bit confused or bewildered, a bit maybe suspicious, and he asks the other one, "What do you mean? Are you with them or with us?" So it turns out they are discussing the three G price options that the two competing Palestinian cellular companies propose. 3G is a big thing now in the West Bank, since only lately, when the world is already approaching 5G, I think, did Israel allow the Palestinian companies to use this service, and only in the West Bank, not in Gaza. So it is a big thing. Playing on the theme of with them or with us shows the sense of humor, even self-teasing, some reflections on a formerly highly politicized society, acutely aware of the permanent enemy that endangers it, but a society which has been drawn in the past 10 years or more so to heavy consumerism and to the exaltation of corporations. Or you can read another interpretation there. Perhaps it's a hint to the endemic internal splits and hostilities that characterize Palestinian politics, also through the commercials. The radio programs state the obvious. There is a society here, a presence that is firm and unquestionable. This is what I hear from, not only from the programs, but very much from them. And look, more than 30 years ago, Edward Said, in his lyrically political book, After the Last Sky, wrote so powerfully, and I cite, "But for the people who live in or near the interior," meaning the country, "where it is impossible to deny their Palestinian origins, there is at least the privilege of obduracy. Here we are, unmoved by your power, proceeding with our lives and with future generations. These statements of presence are fundamentally silent, but they occur with unmistakably force." My favorite radio programs are certainly not silent. They are very talkative statements of presence. And as a dessert, what fascinates me in those programs are the different accents speakers have. Each small region in Palestine, each small region in the West Bank has its own distinct accent. At the age of 13 and during a visit in Amman, your brother, Wadia Said, the son of Maryam and Edward, insisted on asking every person whether he was Jordanian or Palestinian. The father tells in the book, After the Last Sky. A taxi driver, whose accent was clearly Palestinian, answered that he was Jordanian, to the dismay of father and son. As retaliation to the son's counter-arguments that it cannot be so, the driver dumped them far away from their destination. The Palestinian accent, yes, there is, but under its umbrella, there are so astonishingly many sub-dialects and accents. You Brits, having all your dialects and accents, and then those which have developed in your many colonies all over the globe, would not comprehend my fascination. But for a Jew born in Israel, like myself, the standard is accents in Hebrew, which only tell about the speaker's country and language of origin, and which anyway disappear with the second generation. At the same time, in the very same tiny piece of land, there is a plethora of Palestinian accents. Surely, they tell about how even neighboring communities were isolated in the past from each other. But they also tell about the span of time that allowed for such differences to develop. Driving and listening to Palestinian radio stations, I also hear the time, the rootedness, and the social and human richness, versatility, accumulated over hundreds of years. But in those very main roads, time, rootedness, and versatility are obliterated. Except of some rare cases, the road signs do not indicate the names of Palestinian villages and towns. While any tiny, internationally illegal Jewish colony, we have to remember this, even an unauthorized and illegal outpost, appear on those signs. Ramallah, Nablus, Hebron, and other bigger towns, and the new town Rawabi, still under construction, but endeared to the quartet and its former head, Tony Blair, are the exceptions. Most villages, towns, and other Palestinian communities can be observed on both sides of the main roads. They are visible, but they have no names. For thousands of soldiers, tens of thousands of settler commuters, hikers and foreign tourists, those villages remain anonymous. An Orientalist decoration with a minaret and green fluorescent, a two-dimensional work of stills, mute and aesthetic, just like the millions of olive trees that puncture the hill slopes and the lovingly crafted ancient terraces, or the bushy oak trees and the glowingly yellow flowers of the acacia. The acacia, or mimosa, by the way, was brought from Southwest Australia to Palestine by the British occupier in the 1920s. I don't know how quickly did the Jewish colonizers endorse it too, but it is classified today as one of the most harmful invasive plants, and there are ongoing attempts to at least check its spread. Back to the signs. In Main Road number 60, for example, they tell the drivers, the signs tell the drivers what their destinations are, should, and will be. Jerusalem, for example, or Tel Aviv, the colony of Ariel, or that of Kiryat Arba and Bet El. Of course, Tel Aviv is off-limit to most Palestinian drivers. The same is true about Kiryat Arba or Bet El, unless you are a worker who lives there, but you cannot enter those settlements with your car. Large Palestinian towns such as Al-Bireh and the village of Turmus Aya do not have their own signs. And this can mean only one thing. For the Israelis in charge, the tens of thousands of Palestinians do not count. The deficient road signs should be read like a historical document, analyze the way archaeologists examine bones and women scrutinize the language of their male employers or colleagues. Just last week, I asked Netivei Israel, the National Company for Transport Infrastructure, a question concerning a certain new road sign. It notifies of new infrastructure works to enlarge and improve a certain dangerous junction in Road 60, a few kilometers east of Ramallah. The sign is only in Hebrew, and it names the place Tzomet Givat Asaf, Asaf's Hill Junction. This is an outpost. Givat Asaf is an outpost that settled on private land stolen by false documentation from people in the nearby Palestinian village of Beitin. The settlers could not convince the authorities yet to launderize the outpost. So it is still enlisted as one that should be evacuated, this outpost. But it's not. The spokesperson of Netivei Israel answered politely and promptly, explaining that the places are named by how they are known to the general public. But the general public here, of course, or the great majority of the general public in this area are Palestinians. And they would more probably know it by the names of the villages Dir Dibuan, Beitin, and Burka. This wide road, not by accident, was built in the 90s on their agricultural lands of these villages in order to allow settlers to bypass the historical roads which go through Palestinian towns. Nevertheless, the direct exits of those three villages to Road 60 and Ramallah have been blocked by the army and the planners, Israeli planners. Burka villagers, for example, instead of reaching Ramallah in 5 to 8 minutes, must make a detour of 30 to 45 minutes. So they shouldn't pass by the outpost. It does not take an economist to calculate the heavy extra costs on the village, which has been impoverished because it cannot access 1/3 of its lands that are either inside settlements or near violent, threatening settlers. So an Israeli governmental infrastructure company ignores the tens of thousands of Palestinian drivers. It addresses Israelis and settlers only. It considers an outpost a place known to all, and it is laundering an outpost and the outright theft of land. Or take, for example, road number 555 in the north, which runs eastwards from the southern outskirts of Nablus. The road signs along it indicate in Hebrew, Arabic, and English only two places, Itamar and Elon Moreh, two colonies, high up on two or more mountain tops. By the end of 2015, Itamar had 1,305 inhabitants. The second, Elon Moreh, 1,794. But the same road is leading to 5 Palestinian villages as well. Size could not be possibly the reason for the omission of their names. Their population is around 30,000 altogether. Some in one 4,000, in one 13,000, in Bet Furik, and Salem has around 6,000 inhabitants. Moreover, for the past 20 years, the 555 road has been closed to Palestinian traffic. Palestinians are siphoned off to winding bypass or rural roads. There are such similar examples all over the West Bank, both of unmentioned villages and towns and of roads that are blocked to Palestinians. Israelis who drive there have no way to know that they are not in Israel. Now, please allow me now to jump the gun and state the following. Those official signs reflect an Israeli Jewish subconscious or conscious or semi-conscious set of mind where Palestinians do not exist. They extradite a deep wish to see the villages and towns disappear. New and old dwellings, small or big, fancy or simple, rich and poor, tents or concrete and stone-made, on hills and valleys. The deficient Israeli official road signs manifest a desire to make those localities emptied of their inhabitants, memories, claims to history, and rootedness. In a state that is based on the mass expulsion of the native population in 1948 and several other small-scale expulsions, in a political system that refuses to acknowledge its responsibility for this, and with the residue of statements by Jewish Zionist leaders who spoke about transfer as a solution, the danger of repetition constantly hovers above our heads. Ostensibly, the subconscious is not allowed to surface, and the wish is suppressed by realpolitik. Israel's reference to the Oslo Accords with PLO as a guiding text, albeit only when that suits it, could serve as a proof that the Palestinian existence in 1967 occupied territory is a given for Israeli politicians. There are ongoing high-level Israeli-Palestinian meetings, for example, Israel's Minister of Finance and Palestinian Prime Minister, to discuss financial practicalities and ramifications that stem out from the two peoples' existence in the same defined territory and their unequal yet intertwined economies. Having said Palestinian presence in 67 occupied territory requires a clarification. This presence behind and beyond the Israelized main roads and road signs has a distinct appearance, or rather disappearance, that of territorial pockets. The military definition would be territorial cells. At the exits or entrances, as Ahadaf told you, red signs, or at the exits or entrances to these pockets, red signs warn Israelis against entering those often congested pockets under the jurisdiction of Palestinian Authority. Concerted, elaborate, and very targeted architectural, military, and landscaping efforts have been invested by Israel in order to create a reality of scattered Palestinian patches, distinguishable from and engulfed by the large Israelized expanse and residential continuity. The Israeli recognition, then, of a Palestinian presence in 1967 occupied territory has been manifested in the ongoing deliberate motions and actions of condensing, squeezing, pressing of people, herds, belongings, horizons, tracks, cars, cultivated or cultivable lands into designated enclaves or reservations. The quasi-legal envelope or basis of this permanent motion of condensing is the Oslo Framework, which invented an artificial and temporary division of the West Bank into three categories, A, B, and C. Originally, they were meant to determine the gradualness and pace of the Israeli military redeployment in the West Bank. First from A, towns which were immediately transferred to Palestinian administrative and policing authorities. PA could construct and plan there and let its armed security services operate. Then the army should have withdrawn from B, Palestinian villages and some larger ones, mostly bordering Jerusalem. There, Palestinians were granted administrative authority, that means to plan and to build, but policing is limited and requires coordination. And then, no later than 1999, Israel should have redeployed from the vast area of C, which is the land's reservoir, the land's resource of villages and towns and of the planned Palestinian state entity, where and there, in Area C, the population is relatively scarce. By 1999, the Israeli army should have already withdrawn to the colonies, settlements, and military bases. This stage, the final stage of the interim agreement of the Oslo Accords, never happened. The army is present everywhere, in A, in B, and in C. But more importantly, the Palestinian administrative planning and building authorities are limited to the fragments of A and B. The temporary has become permanent, yet again. An old technique of manipulating time and expectations. The negotiated temporariness creates a sense of feasibility, an impression that the international community shares the same expectations and will push for their realization. Expectations for freedom, for independence. The temporariness is the pretext or reason or justification for why the Palestinian negotiators and politicians cling to their seats and their diplomats. The postponed change for the better creates an illusion that time stands still. It hasn't, as we are told by the mushrooming settlers' houses, neighborhoods, and outposts, the Israelized roads and Israelized space. So in 61% of the West Bank, called C, Israel retains its administrative authority to plan, demolish, expropriate land, forbid Palestinians' construction, build for Jews and evacuate Palestinians, drive people away, restrict access, restrict freedom of movement, thus pushing people indirectly and actively to areas A and B. The fragments of A and B are minimized replicas of Gaza, enclaves like Gaza. That of Jenin, for example, that of Nablus, that of Ramallah or Hebron. The patches are delineated by the separation wall or the separation fence, by barbed wire, by security roads, more barbed wire, military watchtowers, roads that are off limits to Palestinians, settlements and their growing agricultural areas, military bases, checkpoints, more barbed wire. At any given moment, each one of the enclaves, and all at once, may be cut from each other or be further fragmented by iron gates, more roadblocks made of rocks or deep trenches, small military patrols, cameras and drones that photograph. And now, le dernier cri is also drones that fire tear gas. This was done in Gaza 2 weeks ago against demonstrators. Experience tells us that experiments tried in Gaza are then being transferred to the West Bank. And the techniques there, which develop, the technique which is being developed in Gaza and the West Bank is then sold to other countries. Here is a map. Here is the map for OCHA that shows the reality of patches. The reality of patches You see, the blue is C, and the yellow is A, and the white-yellow is B. The reality of patches reflects the compromise that Israel has reached, not with the Palestinians, but with itself. Between the desire to see Palestinians disappear, as in 1948, and the realization that the current geopolitical circumstances would not allow it. Concentrating people in fragmented space, broken landscapes, anonymous sub-localities, this is the compromise. And the map, I must say, mellows the detailed factuality of fragmentation, disconnection, unconnectivity, discontinuity, disruption, uncertainty, disorientation, drying up of land, disfiguration of landscapes. We will need 45 hours, not 45 minutes, to detail all the techniques that enable and sustain such factuality, and more hours to describe how people defy and resist them. I'm already frustrated at not being able to give here a fuller list of the techniques. But Google, you'll find them. The semblance of flagelity is one technique. Already in 1971, an Israeli military order, number 418, revised the Jordanian planning law. The main change was entrusting all planning authorities in the hands of the centralized higher planning committee, which was then a department in the civil administration. And the civil administration is a hybrid of civil and military functions and officials. They had some legalistic explanation to this concentration of authorities, something to do with the Jordanian king or kingdom. District and local planning committees, the Palestinian ones, of course, were dismantled, and the Palestinians were robbed of their natural right to plan for themselves on their own land, be it privately owned by the village, or public land. This old military order, which exists till today, laid the foundations for the dual, separate, and unequal infrastructure system that is so visible today. One for Israeli colonists and Jews from over all the world, the other for Palestinians. So many sub-techniques evolved from this early primordial revision of the Jordanian law. At a distance of a few hundred meters, master plans were prepared for settlers, but denied to Palestinians. When some master plans were approved, usually for the enlargement of existing plans, they were always much less spacious than the master plan approved for the Jewish settlers. Then we have the water. Deep water drillings serve a colony, but not an adjacent and older community of herders or farmers. The digging of a cistern to collect rainwater is an offense that Palestinians pay for by having young Israeli soldiers breaking into their locality and destroying the cistern, and in the meanwhile frighten the young kids. The same is true about roads, about adding a room to an existing building, building a tiny clinic or a balcony, all verboten, since no master plan has been approved. Even mobile toilets are considered illegal structures that should be confiscated by our young, ardent, and obedient soldiers. The Israeli officials and spokespersons who give me responses to my question why they, for example, demolished the cistern or confiscated the mobile toilet, they always find shelter in the magic words, illegal, since there is no master plan, as if master plans were something that descended down from heaven and have no relation to human policies. Now the Israeli civil administration insists that Palestinians in Area C, both Bedouin and Falahin and farmers, will be better off, how generous of them, if they move to semi-urbanized permanent locations near the patches of Area A. The law revision that I mentioned before allowed the Israeli authorities to stop from very early stage of the occupation a natural process of growth of Palestinian communities or localities, growth both in size and in numbers. This process is not, of course, unique to Palestine and Palestinians, but in the West Bank it has retained its authentic, organic freshness with the old features of growth that have developed over hundreds of years. Take Khir Betana in the north, southeast of Nablus. It's a predominantly herding community that is also engaged in small-scale agriculture for local consumption. It lives on the borderline between Nablus Hills and the Jordan Valley, nestles between moderate slopes, modest plains, and two springs. It's a stunning view, and the air is fresh as if the world was created yesterday. A mosque built of real stone, not just the peel, at least 100 years old, well-maintained old water cisterns and residential caves tell us of a human continuum of many generations. The family names tell of the origin, the village of Bet Furik. At a certain point, perhaps in the middle of the 19th century, the village, Bet Furik, had not enough space and water for all flocks. Some of its herders wandered further east. At first, they came back after a few days or weeks, or in summers, when it's cooler up the hill. The land, anyway, was considered the villages, or available for all, or leased from Nablus landowners. Then the herders discovered caves, which are good shelters. The caves enabled them to bring the entire family and stay longer, and to enlarge the flock. Gradually, they spent there more time than in the village itself. More children were born in the caves, seeing them as their home. The mosque was probably built when the sense of permanence prevailed, decades after the process had started. Then a simple structure might have been added, such as a storeroom or a kitchen or an animal pen. With time, it looked like a natural extension of the cave itself. Basic relations with the village mother were always maintained, selling cheese and meat in its market, even some bundles of parsley, buying their utensils and basic food, seeing a doctor, then sending the boys to the elementary school. Some kept a small house in the village, others not. And the same is true with hundreds of other such localities. If it was in the plain where there are no caves, then tents made of goat's hair were the natural shelter that with time was replaced by mud and straw constructions. The principle was the same. The need for more water and pasture and agricultural lands, sometimes also internal fights within the village, drove some people away from the original residential epicenter, thus creating ripples of small interrelated communities which with time settled down. But Israel halted this process immediately after 1967. It has classified those localities as unrecognized villages. In the last years, the authorities have adopted the settlers' jargon, which labels them as illegal outposts or invasions. Listen to the chutzpah. Such definitions deny the history and rootedness of the communities. They show disrespect to the versatility of Palestinian forms of living, the impressive cohabitation of different modes of production, the historical itinerary that each community has passed. They expose contempt, perhaps it hides jealousy too, to a traditional economy that is not market-oriented, to residues and proofs of collective ownership of land. Since the Oslo process began, Israeli authorities showed determination to continue and strangulate the many communities in different forms and sizes and in what became Area C, and even in much more fervently than before. Israel also denies the community's right to modify their needs. For example, the desire of girls to go to school as well, the need for kindergarten, something that they didn't have before, or mobile toilets, electricity, paved roads, permanent structures. In El Muntar Bedouin village, east of Jerusalem, another school was built without an Israeli permit. And the High Court, the Honorable High Court judges, accepted the legality of the demolition orders. Abu Hassan, the head of the community, told me half-jokingly, "Look, Saudi Arabia allows its women to drive. Times are changing. So of course we want our daughters or our daughters want to go to school. But still it should be near home, not in a faraway village or town." Zaid, a member of the Women's Committee in an old village, Jubet Dib, east of Bethlehem, which successfully fought against the confiscation of their solar energy system, because the Israeli authorities would not allow them to connect to the electricity grid, told me, "Illiteracy today is not knowing how to use a computer. It is not about the inability to read or write. Our children were being left in school because in the absence of electricity, they had no computers." Burhan Bisharat is originally from Tamun village and lives in a small herders locality in the Jordan Valley named Khalet Makhul. In between ferocious demolitions of his pens and shades, he breeds hundreds of sheep, the family's source of income. His daughters help him when they do not have classes in university or exams. One is studying speech therapy. I guess she has finalized by now. The other, education. If the sheikhs connect to the water and electricity grids that serve nearby settlements and outposts so generously, more people might have moved there to Khalet Makhul. Another village may grow out of it, God forbid. This is exactly what the Israeli restrictions and demolitions aim to prevent. Another old technique is that of declaring herding and agricultural lands, including rural communities within those lands, as training or firing zone, and therefore closed military areas. Today, around 100,000 hectares, or 1,000 square kilometers, which are 18% of the West Bank, are classified as closed firing zone. It is not 29% of Area C, though. By the way, Area A, where the PA is allowed to operate its police, is around 18% of the West Bank. Khirbet Tana is in such declared military zone, though the trainings have never taken place near them or in their residential area. A study by the independent researcher Dror Etkes discovered that in 78% of the training areas, declared training areas, the first ones were in August 1967, so in 78% of these training areas, there has never been any training at all. Only in 10% there has been frequent and intensive training. First in the 1970s, the Israeli authorities, using the winning argument that this was firing zone, they targeted the animals in order to keep the people away. Haj Radwan Qasem of Khirbet Tana told me that in those years the Israelis would shoot and kill their flocks. Some people remember that they killed them from helicopters. Then it didn't help, the people did not run away, and the Israelis started to confiscate the sheep, forcing the owners to pay huge sums of money to redeem them. This happened all over. I hear it from all over the West Bank, and especially in the Jordan Valley about this technique. But in the 1990s, in tandem with the Oslo negotiations, the people started facing bulldozers who attacked their simple dwellings. The Israeli army demolishes, they rebuild. The Israeli army issues orders of evacuation, and they remain or return. All over Area C, I meet those communities which defy Israel's orgies of destruction and restrictions, either because they invaded, the reason that is given, imagine, firing zones, or because they were built without permit, those houses, or both. Bedouin communities, though of a different background and different patterns of inhabiting this expanse, have confronted similarly brutal steps and shown equally heroic resilience. But not everybody can stand such life. And under the pressure, humiliation, and impoverishment, younger people leave to the bigger villages or towns. Exactly for that reason, the number of people in Area C, totally, and especially in the Jordan Valley, remains quite small. As early as summer 1997, one farmer in the green water-rich area of Rush Bedajan area told me that when the Israelis came to demolish his shack, that's just a week before or so, he asked them, "But where should I go once you destroy our home?" And one of them, probably not high-ranking soldier, told him frankly, usually they are frank, the lower rank. He told him, "Go to Arafat," meaning go to Area A, under Palestinian Administrative Authority. And this is another thing that I heard from other people, that soldiers would tell them, frankly, this is not yours, go to Arafat, go to the pocket of A. Years later, a UN official heard an Israeli military bureaucrat explaining, half jokingly, half seriously, the ABC categorization. A is for Arafat, the official said. B is for balagan, a mess in Hebrew, because you have both Israeli and Palestinian authorities. And C is for shelanu, in Hebrew, ours. But the joke is serious. In response to a High Court petition of the village Khir Betana against the demolitions, a representative of the state attorney office wrote, sometime by the end of 2016, "The training areas are the land's input for the security forces, and especially the military. With the development of more advanced weapons and larger firing ranges, arises the need for means for areas that continue to grow, both in Israel and in the West Bank. Land is a resource in short supply. Notwithstanding the security threats to Israel and the Judea and Samaria region, expansive areas, with A, are required for the purpose of training army units." Such arguments I read in almost all states' responses to other petitions against demolitions in Area C. But we know better, and we have the proof. In April 2014, in a closed meeting of the Knesset, the Israeli Parliament Subcommittee, a military officer confided with the participants and told them what every Palestinian would have told you anyway, much earlier. The training in military zones and the military zone themselves in the West Bank is a means to reduce the number of Palestinian inhabitants and play an important role in the fight against, as he termed it, unlicensed Palestinian structures, he said illegal. He stressed that in the past years, the army has intensified its trainings, meaning slightly before 2014. Please remember this subcommittee because I'll return to it. I got the minutes, the secret minutes of this meeting, and we published them. Another old technique, which nevertheless has spread and intensified during the past 20 years, is settlers' violence and terrorizing. It is a very well-targeted violence. They attack farmers in their fields. They attack shepherds. They attack Israeli anti-occupation activists who join farmers and herders. Usually, the attackers are residents of unauthorized outposts. Their visit card is their lawlessness. The army is standing aside, the soldiers watching, for example, as the settlers, often masked, throw stones or approach villagers in a menacing way. In a village in Enabus, south of Nablus, just a few weeks ago, they slaughtered several sheep of a family that I know. The army has found a solution to those attacks. In order to prevent friction, they order Palestinians out of their lands. Commanders issue special orders of closed military zone for these lands where the settlers approach. Then Palestinian farmers are required to ask for an Israeli permit or military escort or military coordination in order to reach their own lands. And this is only twice or 3 times per year, a few days each time. I've been following some of those farmers when they try, through an Israeli-Palestinian lawyer, to reach their olive trees or their fields. And usually it takes them so long that it's too late already to sow the land or to cut the wheat. With or without closed military zones, over the past year, settlers have expanded their agricultural activities on land that Palestinians were not allowed to access. There is a clear division of labor here between the perpetrators of physical violence and those of perpetrators of bureaucratic violence and aggression. Settlers intimidate and terrorize, and then also spy, now aided by drones, after Palestinian communities who might add a sheikh or a mobile home. The soldiers keep Palestinians away from their lands. The civil administration issues demolition orders. The police does not investigate settlers' violence. Then another outpost is added, and the perimeter of terrorizing and intimidating enlarges and approaches the villages' houses. There are lands where settlers do not need to use violence. Thousands of hectares have been locked behind the separation wall built in the early 2000s. At first, all Palestinian farmers in every village received permits to cross the gates that soldiers should open twice a day and reach their lands. Israel wanted to convince the world that the wall was built deep into the West Bank only for security reasons and not for the purpose of theft, as we suggested anew. With the years, farmers found it more and more difficult to obtain permits to reach their own lands on a regular basis, while Israelis hiked there freely, as if these beautifully planted hills and plains were their neighborhood park. What a beautiful view, I heard some hikers in the lands of a village called Kafr Sur, north of Kalkilia. The owners of these lands and those people who planted the trees or whose grandparents planted the trees cannot reach it. Some hikers said it was a nature reserve. Others said it was a national park planted by the Jewish National Fund. Others said it was declared as a forest reserve already during the British Mandate, which is true. But all these years, the villagers could reach the land and plant there. With time, Israeli hikers see less and less Palestinians who come to work the land, or none. The Israeli civil administration keeps changing and complicating the regulations of getting a permit to access the land. Now, each person who wants to go through the gate has to be registered as the lawful owner of the piece of land he tends to. This demand shows complete disregard to the collective or family ownership of land, and it is a way to destroy it. The legal process of ownership registration is cumbersome and expensive, and the number of days that a person is permitted to reach his or her land depend on the size. How hours are lost at the closed gate on detours to the land which is at normal distance of 5 minutes walk. People, especially young, are discouraged from reaching the land. You see more and more only old people going there. The space a village has is thus contracted, squeezed. Hooray, the Israeli mind has created another densely populated enclave, unseen and unnoticed by the average Israeli. A year ago, 2 Dutch Jews, a couple, asked me what, in the process of researching and documenting, was emotionally most difficult for me. I said without hesitation, the planning. They understood. Both researched the Nazi period. Don't worry, it is not for drawing parallels, but it is to explain how in our history and in our family's plight, planning and premeditation as concepts haunt us. A week ago, I met a group of young American Jews, hosted by Breaking the Silence. They belong to the recently formed organization called If Not Now, and they try to stir discussions and doubts about Israeli policies within the Jewish community in the US. After a week or so, they told me, they were mostly appalled by how things seem to be well planned. And indeed, when it comes to measures against Palestinians, there is the Israeli skill of planning ahead, while pretending to only react, to take ad hoc necessary measures because of a certain crisis. The sealing of Gaza, the closure policy, the movement restrictions, the wall, all have been portrayed as temporary reactions to some security escalation. Planned or not, there is the skilled division of labor between individual violence of settlers and the institutionalized bureaucratic violence that I mentioned earlier. Bureaucratic violence has many forms. Demolition orders is one, or the theft of water and quotas on drinking water and water for domestic use is another form of institutionalized violence. Restrictions on movement is a third example. Controlling the Palestinian population registry is a fourth. The last two forms may actively drive people out of the country, not just to the enclaves. I spoke very little of Gaza today, hardly nothing. This huge detention camp for 2 million people would have required 45 days, not 45 hours. But let me tell you of my friend's children, all in their late 20s. Muhammad followed his father's and brother's steps and became a doctor. He studied in Egypt and returned home to serve his society. But then he realized that he had no chance to advance his career there when he is actually in prison. Bashar is an engineer. He failed to find a job in Gaza. He now works in Germany. Nuwar is a startupist. She was already invited abroad to present her online initiative and the young company that she established and she directs. An intervention of Western aid organizations secured her once an Israeli permit to leave the Gaza Strip. An Arab investor showed interest in the company, but this time she did not receive a permit to leave and meet with him. Next time, she says, when she manages to leave Gaza, perhaps through Rafah, she will not return. Her parents know it, and with a broken heart encourage her to leave. All those young, talented men and women, many others, love Gaza and would have remained there if they had the freedom of movement. Their families are not rich or well connected. Perhaps they are just more ambitious than the others who do remain in the Gaza Strip and dream to live. 2 years ago, Israel eased its restrictions. It now allows a certain number of Gazans to live abroad every month through the Jordanian border, after years it did not allow so, actually since 1997. But there are two conditions for this generous change. On their way, Gazans are not allowed to stop in the West Bank, not even to say hello to a friend, not even to stay a few days there. And they must sign a pledge to remain abroad a whole year. Another example, a Gazan woman whose name I don't know is married to a promising official at the Palestinian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Ramallah. Israel does not allow Gazans to move to the West Bank since the early 90s, immediately after Oslo. Her marriage to a West Banker did not impress the Israeli bureaucrats. After failed pleas and interventions on their behalf, after all they have some wasta connections, the young man received a position abroad. He would not have left the country if his wife were allowed to move to Ramallah. Even what is considered luckiest choice one may make, living and working abroad, is manipulated by Israeli aggression, whose direct intention is not totally clear, but is certainly malign. Perhaps the bureaucrats and commanders assume that the most energetic will succeed in leaving a brain and energy drain that will certainly affect negatively the entire population. There is a similar phenomenon in the West Bank, though on a smaller scale. Youth feel caged. What Israel has done in Gaza is the model they dread will happen to their enclaves as well. And they are afraid to lose their life on nothingness, despair, and the humiliation of being caged. Israel maintains its control over the Palestinian population registry. This means that it authorizes or not the stay of non-Palestinians who are married to Palestinians. Often those Palestinians, those foreign nationals, are Palestinians who were born abroad or lost their status as residents of the West Bank after 1967 because they lived abroad. Since 10 years, Israel has stopped all processes of family reunification, a process by which it grants identity cards to those spouses of Palestinians. Lately, it also restricts again the visas given to the non-Palestinian spouses. So instead of getting a visa for half a year, they get a visa for 2 weeks. So they have to leave and come back. And then they don't know once coming back if they will get a visa or will be told to stay outside. Now there is one of the conditions to giving the spouses a visa. It has always been, but now it is applied much more vigorously. So one of the conditions is that the people, the spouses, should not work. I've known doctors, teachers, music teachers, artists who are told by the Israeli civil administration, we cannot allow you a visa because you broke the terms and you worked. How would people not work? So these two are the closest, what I mentioned about Gaza, the restrictions of movement and the holding of and the control of the population registry are the closest to active intervention in favor of expulsion, not to A and B, but outside of the country. Of course, Jerusalem has been the most prominent example of the laws in Jerusalem concerning residents of Jerusalem. There has been the most active acts of expulsion from the country since the end of the war in 1967. The law actually in Jerusalem says that Palestinians born in Jerusalem are residents, like, I don't know, some Christians who move to Israel on their own free will, and if they don't stay in Jerusalem and Jerusalem is not the center of their life, their status will be revoked. Because of Israeli policies, it was very hard for many people to live in Jerusalem proper. They moved to neighborhoods, Palestinian neighborhoods, 500 meters away from Jerusalem borders. And after 1996, again in tandem with Oslo, with the advance of Oslo, their IDs, their status of residence was revoked because they did not live anymore their life is not the center of, in Jerusalem. 500 meters away. Thousands of people lost their IDs, their status. Many regained it after a struggle, and many were discouraged and left the country. Now there is a new law which was accepted that for political reasons, Palestinian Jerusalemites would lose their residency status, if they were showed or did not show allegiance to the state of Israel, or if they were engaged in political activity like Hamas. And there are some members of parliament, Hamas members, whose status was revoked several years ago, 10 years ago. Then they fought. They were in jail, then they were sent to Ramallah. They fought in High Court. And High Court told the Israeli government, this is illegal what you did, you cannot revoke, so please go and write a law, a new law, that will enable us. So now we don't know. It starts with Hamas, but where will it move? Those three examples that I brought here and show that wherever it can, Israel pushes people out of the cages and the enclaves abroad, also outside of the country. There is a bill that some members of parliament tried to pass but failed, but the atmosphere is created, a bill that demands to expel from the country families of terrorists. Families. So it is as we call collective punishment. Who will define what a family is, what a terrorist is, what is to be done? It is checked. It has not passed. There is the legal, still judges and the legal advisor of the government say it's illegal, but the atmosphere is being created. There is a party in Israel which should get its credit for planning ahead and calculating well its steps and activities. And this is Habayit HaYehudi, the Jewish home. Bennett, Naftali Bennett, is the Minister of Education, and Ayelet Shaked is the Minister of Justice. Neither is a settler, yet their party is the spearhead of the settlers' lobby. Another member of the party, Moti Yogev, is the head of the Knesset subcommittee that I told you about, which is the subcommittee for settlements in Judea and Samaria. He's been advocating, he's one of the most ardent advocates of the law for expelling families of terrorists. His subcommittee has become the private yard of Habayit HaYehudi and of an NGO called Regavim for the protection of the lands, of the nation's land, and of representatives of different settlements. Together, they pressure, Regavim and this subcommittee pressure the Israeli civil administration to expel Bedouins from, mostly Bedouins, but others too, in Area C, to areas A and B, and to demolish their homes in order to expand the settlements. And they have been very successful. Their pressure has been very successful. Ayelet Shaked moved or stopped the process of allowing Palestinians who have grievances about their land taken by settlers. They cannot go anymore to High Court. They should do it in regional courts. One of the judges she nominated used to be the head of a committee that launderized outposts that are stealing land from Palestinians. So I bring these examples to let you know about the planning. You see that this is a party represents settlers, represents a set of mind that does not want to see Palestinians, and is able to reach its goals. At this point, I found it hard to write down what I want to say and how I want to end it. When people ask me, people ask journalists, so what do you say will happen? And I say that I am a conservative journalist. I prefer to speak about what was and what is happening, not about what will happen. And when I say that I fear the stage where Israeli settlers and Israeli politicians will feel secure enough to cause a mass expulsion of Palestinians out of the country, be it of some villages, be it of mass expulsion of cities, I don't know. I find I could not write these obscenities. I found it difficult to write the obscenities. And if I say it because, as I said, it is preventable, but we have to face and to understand the smug, the self-confidence that the settlers and the settlers' lobby has. To understand that Israelis have come to such a point that they are not moved by news of a cistern that is being demolished, or a toilet, mobile toilet that is being confiscated. So how can we expect them, most of them, to resist mass expulsion? In October, a group of a person who is Canadian by origin and is very active for what he calls the solution of that Jordan is the Palestinian state. He had some kind of a conference. I went to listen. The hall had some 300, 400 people, most of them Anglo-Saxons, settlers. They looked like settlers. And he has some plan, and he says that there are some Jordanians who say that Jordan is Palestine, and that that eventually the king has to, the kingdom has to fall, the king has to fall. It's ridiculous, and Palestinians should move to Jordan, of course gently, and will pay them a lot of money and encourage them. But this is the solution. One of the speakers in that conference was a settler from Hebron. He came with a gun, and Hebron, you probably know, is the place where the vision of mass expulsion, even though not abroad, mass expulsion of cities' inhabitants has been accomplished. Again, a few months ago, these are examples why my fear of expulsion are not my imagination. A former commander and today's Minister of Housing, who is in a mainstream, in a so-called centrist party, he has a plan to populate the Jordan Valley. And he said, in the Jordan Valley there are 70,000, he didn't say that, I say that, 70,000 Palestinians. And as I said, it is very little because of Israeli restrictions, but there are around 70,000. And he spoke on radio, and he was interviewed by journalists, and he said there are only 5,000 people in the Jordan Valley, only 5,000 people. Nobody corrected him, and he continued to disseminate his plan. In the Jordan Valley, the main road in the Jordan Valley, number 90, was called in 2003 or 2004, or 2004, this main road, length road, is called after Rehavam Ze'evi. Rehavam Ze'evi was the first, was an ex-commander, Israeli commander, who was advocating since the 80s the solution of voluntary transfer of Palestinians to outside of the country. And he was assassinated by a cell of the Popular Front in 2001. He was assassinated, so the road is after his name. Very cynical to have a main road in the eastern part of the West Bank after the symbol of Israeli policies or vision of mass expulsion. But this is Israel of today, and again I say, this is preventable, but for this to be preventable, we know that this is it exists. This vision exists, so-called vision, exists among Israelis, who at best would say Palestinians have to thank us that they are still here. I would like to finish by a short scene of an expulsion taken place, not outside, but that should interest us.
You can't just let anybody settle on state-owned land. If you pitch up a tent and decide to live here, the authorities will come and remove you.
I'm standing in a place called Bir Maskob, which is translated as the Moscow Well. And it's midway between Jerusalem and Jericho. But just up there is the largest Israeli settlement on the West Bank. We're in the center of the West Bank now. This is Ma'ale Adumim, and it's constantly expanding. There's a military post on the other side of this hill. For the last several days, they've been living without shelter, and their plight is, well, I think the only word for it is tragic, is disastrous. And this, in essence, is the Palestinian tragedy, that daily uprootings, daily evictions, daily destruction of property and homes takes place, and people are powerless to do anything about it.
The territory we are negotiating about is virtually uninhabited by Palestinians. There are only a few thousand Bedouins that roam about. Yet this land is the canvas on which thousands of years of Jewish history have been etched. And it has powerful implications.
The world has taken very little notice of this, and I must say, it's very, very hard for me to stand here talking about it when I see my own people going through this endless Calvary. Look, I mean, the little bits of plastic, the little logs, the bit of railing here, a tin can crushed here. I mean, these are the atoms out of which the tragedy of Palestine is constructed every day, every minute, every hour for 50 years, and it's continuing. And we hear about the peace process, but who is protecting, who is giving these people peace?